morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I appreciate that y'all turn on your cameras to say hi. I appreciate that.
Good morning.
Some smiling faces. Alrighty, I'm gonna give it again just a minute or two like I usually do for people that are having to log on a little bit late or struggling with the tech. We all know that's our life now. So we'll get started here in a couple minutes, and today's a lecture day. So I'll be talking about some of the concepts the book goes over related to culture.
What?
Well, hello. Did you come to say hi to everybody? You got to be more over here so I can see you. There you go. He knows how to like just stay out of view on the desk. Well, we will go ahead and get started. So like I said, today I'm going to talk about the major concepts from your book about culture. For this lecture in particular, it focuses more on sort of like cross-cultural things, but certainly these apply to within culture, or to other sort of diversity issues, marginalized populations. So for your readings for our discussion day on Monday, one of the ones on Blackboard that I added is actually about people who are part of the LGBTQ plus community and how some of these same concepts might be related to them. So let me go ahead and get the logistics set up here. There we go. Okay, let my camera focus. All right, and then I will screen share. So I have to say, I was watching like an official webinar yesterday, and they messed up their screen share, and it made me feel a lot better about myself as a person. So I was like, oh, I'm not the only one who has tech problems sometimes. I'm gonna go ahead and get the chat out in case anybody has any questions they want to type there. You can always unmute and flag me down too. So today we will touch on some of the differences in personality we see cross-culturally, but again, some of these things will apply to just marginalized groups in general. And I think I mentioned this when we did our syllabus day, but I think it's really important to do this at the beginning of the semester, even though these chapters tend to be shoved to the end of psych books, right? Because A, sometimes that means you don't get to it in the semester, which I think is horrible. And B, it helps us keep in mind as we go forward that the vast majority of the theories that we'll talk about were developed for Caucasian, European, or European American people. So it's kind of a nice framework to think about, okay, but who does this actually apply to? There we go. Right, so we have to kind of think about what is culture. You know, is culture, you know, being sort of acting like a teenager when you're maybe in your 30s or 40s, right? I mean, there's definitely a culture of that. And then we also have to think about diversity. So if you can't read the bottom of this, it says, our goal is to stress diversity while remaining a university. So those of you who are from diverse backgrounds, I'm sure are very aware of how all colleges, including Wesleyan, do our marketing. So for example, one of my former advisees was African-American woman, and she was in a lot of pictures on the website. Dr. Gonzalez Jackson is photographed a lot, right? So on one hand, yes, we should celebrate our people who are of minority status, but on the other hand, we shouldn't misrepresent, right, the actual diversity that exists or doesn't exist. So what is culture? So according to psychology, it's the psychological attributes of groups. Psychological attributes of groups. So culture has got to be a group, and that could be a tribe, right? Or it could be a whole country, or even, you know, a whole area of the world. So the psychological attributes of groups, including customs, habits, beliefs, and values. Customs, habits, beliefs, and values. And those are going to shape a lot of parts of our individual psychology, basically. So they're going to shape emotions, behaviors, and life patterns. Emotions, behaviors, and life patterns. So I'll say that whole thing again, because it's a very wordy definition. So culture is psychological attributes of groups, including customs, habits, beliefs, and values that shape emotions, behaviors, and life patterns. Now, other things that may be a part of culture can include things like language, for example, although that's not always part of your indigenous culture, right? So there are parts of the world that speak Spanish, not because that was their original language, but because the Spanish were the people who colonized them, right? Just like parts of the US that speak English for the same reason. Or parts of Canada that speak French. So that can become a part of your culture, but you know, it's not, it's a sort of different aspect of it, right? It can also include the ways you think about the world, right? So how you explain how life began, right? How you explain how people interact with each other, what's expected of other people, how you explain, you know, the natural elements in our world. And it also relatedly can relate to your fundamental views of reality. So what do you think is real? What do you think is not? An example I can think of are some Native American nations. I think it's always important to point out that there's not one Native American, right? There's a whole bunch of different nations. And some believe in the power of dreams, that they really speak to us, or doing like a vision quest, and that's actually something that happens that is really meaningful, whereas other people would think that's, you know, not something that they would take stock in. So there are two terms that come up here about some of the stuff I've already started to refer to, right? So when cultures are sort of within other cultures, so enculturation is the process of socialization in which you acquire your native culture. So enculturation, geez, is the process of socialization through which you acquire your native culture. And this is often mainly early in life. Acculturation is the process of partially or fully acquiring a new cultural outlook. So we see this in particular in immigrants, for example, who may decide to acculturate to different levels, or just they don't make the decision, it just sort of happens, right? So enculturation is your native culture. Acculturation is assimilating to a different culture. So how can we compare one culture to another? Well, to be perfectly honest, the vast majority of the time throughout our history, some American, European person has looked at another culture and tried to show how it's inferior to ours, which we don't. Well, there are people who still do this, right? But like good psychologists with scientific grounding try really hard not to do this anymore. But if we were just to look at cultures and try to compare them to one another, what we would look at are things like behavior. We would look at how they experience or express emotion. We would look at how they think about things, their thoughts, about their sense of connection to the world. That they see the world as something for their taking, or that they see something that they want to be in harmony with. And what we tend to do is look for similarities and differences. Pictures on the slide show people of different cultures smiling. And in all different cultures, that expresses happiness. Now, that's not necessarily universal. Among tribal peoples, sometimes a smile is more of a sign of aggression. But for a lot of folks, a lot of different cultures, a smile is an expression of joy. So one of the things we look at as to how to compare cultures is EMICS, E-M-C-S, which is on your slide, so I didn't need to spell it. But this is aspects of a phenomenon that are specific to a particular culture. So specific to a particular culture. So this is what makes that culture unique. The EMICS are the things that are specific or unique to that particular culture. Remember EMICS is, if you think of the M, the me sound, you can think of like me, my culture, EMICS. Ethics, or edicts, I've heard it pronounced both ways, are aspects of a phenomenon that all cultures have in common. So all cultures have it in common. The cue I use here is the T could kind of be seen as like a plus sign. So it's like all the cultures have it, cross-culture. So one of the things we talk about is edicts and evolution. And so we'll talk about evolutionary theory a little bit later on in the semester, but I think it's really important to touch on it here because unfortunately, evolutionary psychologists, like some people in evolutionary theory, have taken it and sort of used it in a way that's to the detriment of marginalized people. And this is not something that Darwin ever intended. It's actually something his cousin Galton did. So Darwin's cousin Galton was really the one who came up with like the survival of the fittest. Darwin didn't really frame it that way. And Galton was a big eugenicist. So, we should celebrate him. And so sometimes when we're looking at behavioral genetics or evolutionary psych, it's not great. And we're going to kind of explain some of the reasons why. And a lot of this perspective is from Ben Newberry, who was my grad professor. Now, that being said, there is some really good stuff about evolutionary psych, and Dr. Marrell teaches a whole class on it if you are interested in it. So behavioral genetics deals with the possibility that individual differences in psychology are genetic. So the simplest way to think about behavioral genetics is to think about something like depression. We know depression tends to run in families. It seems to have a genetic component, right? So that's behavioral genetics. Evolutionary psychology is more aimed at edicts. It's aimed at general genetic universals. So what are the basic genetic conditions of the human species? And again, because it's psychological, particularly behaviorally. So there are some quasi-myths about this. The idea that evolution is always going to go towards progress, is always going to like make us better, right? Even if we just think about the animal world. So like crocodiles haven't changed, right, since the time of the dinosaurs. It doesn't mean that they're not a great species. Clearly things have worked, right? But they haven't been constantly evolving to like super crocodiles that take up a whole continent. right? So sometimes it just is there. There's not always this great mysterious force pulling evolution upward. So the idea is that life is always going to become more complex. And there's some instances of things that have developed complexity and then become simple again. An example is intestinal parasites. Those are pretty simple. And they unfortunately get the job done. If you've ever had one, it's not pleasant. Many older things haven't died out, like bacteria. And in fact, bacteria have a greater weight than everything else living on this planet put together. Just like process that. You put together all the whales and elephants and humans and plants, and all the bacteria would still weigh more, right? And this idea has been adapted humorously into a movie called Idiocracy. So let me give you the premise of this film. So they decide to try cryogenically freezing some people, and they want to find the people who are like the most average possible. So like average intelligence, average, height, that type of thing. And then something goes awry, and these people wake up many, many years later. During that process, while they've been cryogenically frozen, one thing has led to another, and when they wake up, they're the smartest people on Earth. And so I am going to YouTube this clip just because it is technically copyrighted. And so they often take it down. And I'll do a new share so we can get the clip and get the sound, and just show you the first 4 or so minutes of the movie that kind of pokes a hole in this idea of psychology always, or evolution always going towards something more progressive.
As the 21st century began, human evolution was at a turning point. Natural selection, the process by which the strongest, the smartest, the fastest reproduced in greater numbers than the rest, a process which had once favored the noblest traits of man, now began to favor different traits. Most science fiction of the day predicted a future that was more civilized and more intelligent. But as time went on, things seemed to be heading in the opposite direction, a dumbing down. How did this happen? Evolution does not necessarily reward intelligence. With no natural predators to thin the herd, it began to simply reward those who reproduced the most and left the intelligent to become an endangered species.
Having kids is such an important decision.
We're just waiting for the right time. It's not something you want to rush into, obviously.
No way.
Oh, shit, I'm pregnant again!
I got too many damn kids. Thought you was on the pill or some shit.
Hell no!
Must have been thinking of Brittany.
Brittany? No, you... There's no way we could have a child now. Not with the market the way it is now.
No, that just wouldn't make any sense.
He don't care about you.
Yeah, well, there must be something he likes over here.
You mean nothing to me, baby? It wasn't me. It wasn't me.
Well, we finally decided to have children, and I'm not pointing fingers, but it's not going well.
And this is helping.
I'm just saying that before I have in vitro, maybe you should be willing to...
It's always me, right?
Well, it's not my sperm count.
Yeah! I'm gonna fuck all of you! That's my boy!
Cleavon is lucky to be alive. He attempted to jump a jet ski from a lake into a swimming pool and impaled his crotch on an iron gate. But thanks to recent advances in stem cell research and the fine work of Doctors Krinsky and Altshuler, Cleavon should regain full reproductive function.
Get your hands off my junk!
Unfortunately, Trevor passed away from a heart attack while masturbating to produce sperm for artificial insemination. But I have some eggs frozen, so just as soon as the right guy comes along,
And so it went for
So that gives you the general gist of things here. Let me reshare our PowerPoint. By the way, Idiocracy is a really funny movie. A little, maybe too spot on at times now. Just like heads up on that if you decide to watch it.
That's one of my favorite movies.
Is it? Nice, yeah. It feels really real now, right? Like, I remember a couple of years ago, someone asked me to be on a panel, and they were talking about, I don't know, something, and, related to this. And they said, like, do you think we're getting better? And I said, well, Wipeout is just ow my balls, right? So there's this, when they wake up in the future, one of the best TV shows is just called Ow My Balls, right? So yeah, recommend you stream the whole thing. But this idea is that, sometimes the, best and brightest of a species, including humans, might not be the ones who reproduce the best. And again, obviously there are some classist ideas in there that are problematic in and of themselves, right? But it does sort of, get to the point of not all people reproduce equally, right? Another idea is that evolution is slow and gradual. So this is sort of true, but not always. Sometimes you get small changes in genes that cause sudden large changes. And then you have other things that are static, like I mentioned before, crocodiles. The idea that every trait we have is adapted and have been selected for. I mean, sometimes traits exist as correlated characteristics. So there's something adapted that is selected for, but then something else on the same gene comes along for the ride. Do we need an appendix when X% of people have to have it out, right? And then the idea that characteristics we see functioning were selected for the function we see them performing, not always. So a big example of this is just the human brain, right? So it was selected for what? We're not actually sure, probably something hunter-gathery, right? But the things we do today, the things y'all are doing right now, taking notes, looking at your computer screen, right, didn't even exist when our brains evolved to this point. Now, in terms of behavior in evolutionary psychology, the human brain is a collection of evolved mechanisms, right? It's not just like one thing that evolved. This is the basic idea. Each is a solution to an adaptive problem, and this could explain cross-cultural similarities in behavior. However, in this view, the brain is not necessarily a general process, just sort of like a computing system. And this was an idea really back in the 70s, that the human brain is just like a computer. And that you get sort of this hodgepodge of rigid sets of behaviors out of that. Again, this doesn't necessarily make sense considering what we can do now. Like, why would the brain have evolved for something like texting or driving while texting, right? It wouldn't have, because driving while texting can kill you. Another thing, and this is something that ends up making me the most upset, is reproductive behavior and mating preferences. So the standard idea in evolutionary psych is that men are going to biologically be selected to mate widely, so like Cleavon in that Idiocracy clip, and that women are biologically selected to mate wisely, so to be careful about their mate. But as Dr. Newberry told us, shouldn't the males go along with the women's program if they want to mate, right? Like, don't you have to kind of like buy into it? Otherwise, it seems like males would be evolutionary inclined to act like jackasses, right? If they want to be married and have kids, they probably, buy into the system. And they do, right? Other things that exist in our culture don't fit into this idea, right? So we have single mothers, we have modern families that have same-sex parents, we have kids who are raised by parents that aren't biologically theirs, right? Or, are their grandparents, something along those lines. And birth control doesn't make sense in terms of this, right? So if we were just supposed to be like mating all over the place, we wouldn't have ever bothered inventing birth control. So if we're biologically driven to pass on our genes, the availability of condoms or the pill shouldn't influence our behavior, but we know that it does. Or another thing, if we think about like the one-child policy that existed for years in China, or people's reaction to the Duggars, right? The 19 kids and counting family, right? If we were just supposed to mate as much as we could, people wouldn't be like, ooh, 19 kids, right? So again, not quite. And then in terms of culture and learning, people figure stuff out for themselves, right? I mean, like, y'all are doing that right now. And people can make similar calculations to evolution or sort of defy evolution. So evolutionary psychology does have a way to go in order to prove there are actually universals that are biologically driven and not developed from other things, such as universal cultural similarities. There are also general differences between cultures, and psychologists have tried to like wrap our heads around how to discuss these, basically since we've had psychology as a field. So early ideas about how to describe cultures included tough versus easy. Easy was that individuals can pursue many different goals, and at least some are easy to obtain. And tough was that there were few goals viewed as valuable and few ways they could be achieved. One thing people looked at is maybe stressfulness. So they looked at things like suicide, homicide, fights, viewing events as characteristic by witchcraft, for example. So the picture down in the corner here is the statue of Grace Sherwood. So if you drive by Centerra Bayside, which I think might not actually be called Centerra Independence now, right at the corner of Witch Duck and Independence, you will see this statue of Grace Sherwood, and she is called the Witch of Pungo, and Witch Duck is actually named after her, the road. And she was alive from 1660 to 1740, and she's a local legend in what used to be Princess Anne County and is now Virginia Beach City. She was known as the Witch of Pungo to historians and locals. She was accused of bewitching a neighbor's crop in 1698. Allegations grew over time until the Princess Anne County government and her accusers decided she would be tested by ducking. So in 1706, she was dropped into the western branch of Lynnhaven River, which is now known as Witch Duck Point. Sherwood floated, which is a sign of guilt to her accusers. Like, side note, if you sunk, you were innocent, right? So if they didn't get you out in time, they were drowning the innocent person. Just putting that out there. So she was imprisoned for 7 years, but eventually released. She lived the rest of her life quietly down in Pungo and lived to the age of 80, which was actually a huge deal back then. And the governor of Virginia actually pardoned her in like 2000 something. So interesting. So, you know, we have a history of that in our area, which I think is kind of interesting, quirky. Another way that we've talked about cultures is the emphasis on the need for achievement versus affiliation. In the US, we tend to be the little engine that could mentality. I think I can, I think I can, I think I can, going for achievement. Other cultures focus more on affiliation, needs for love, but the causality of that is unclear, and also there are cultures where really both are pretty prominent. Complexity. So again, this is one of our racist ones that we have, or ethnocentric ones that we have, xenophobic. Modern versus simple cultures. So who decides what's actually more complex, more modern? And if you look at the things that would have been labeled as simple cultures, they often actually have very complex systems. So for example, Native American tribes had families, chiefs, alliance, religions, again, and those differed between the different nations. And there were, you know, complexities within that. So the idea that because they didn't like evolve all the modern technology, they're simple is questionable. And then there's tightness, looseness in terms of the tolerance for deviation for proper behavior. So tightness allows very little deviation from proper behavior. To enforce norms, they sort of encourage people to be similar and they have them live closer together. And then looseness allows for more flexibility. People are more diverse and tend to be more spread out. People see the US as a loose culture, but it really depends on where you live, right? So if I just think about colleges, right? So there's a college in Ohio called Oberlin College, and they have like co-ed dorms and co-ed bathrooms, and everything is, you know, very accepting, very culturally and other ways diverse. Within our same country of the US, Bob Jones University exists, which has very rigid standards, including dress codes where women have to wear skirts, for example. So tightness, looseness probably doesn't fit to our overall culture. So one of the ways we've really started to think about this, and that you'll see talked about a lot in the psychological literature, is collectivism versus individualism. So this is a view of the relationship between the individual and society. And really looks at the importance of needs and then the rights of the group versus the rights of the individual. And it looks at the clarity of the boundary between the individual and the group. So the example I always give, the US is an individualistic culture. And then some East Asian cultures are more collectivist. So my father is recently retired, but was an automotive engineer for years. And he went to Japan at one point and was doing a presentation, and one particular member of their team stayed up the night before and helped him finish it. So he thanked that individual for his work at the presentation the next day, and the member was actually embarrassed and felt it was not proper because the whole team should have been thanked. So that's the collectivist idea, that even if I'm the one who did the work, the team is who should be acknowledged. And we also, the meaning of personality might differ for these cultures. So personality itself as a concept may be more meaningful in individualistic cultures, but that doesn't mean it has no meaning in collectivist cultures. Personality can predict behavior and is consistent across situations in both types of cultures. The interesting thing is, if you look at the number of words to describe personality traits, there are actually more words for them in individualistic cultures' languages. And it's the things that are important to you tend to have more words. So like Inuit people have, I believe, 20 plus different words for snow, for example, because they live in a place where that's a huge part of their lives. Predictors of satisfaction with life. Harmony of relationships with others versus self-esteem and achievement. People from individualistic cultures are more prone to loneliness and depression, we tend to find. So they have preference for doing activities alone, perhaps, rather than in groups sometimes. Experience of emotions, we see that other focused emotions like sympathy may be more prominent in collectivistic cultures rather than self-focused emotions like anger. Another example is marriage. So not every collectivistic culture, but arranged marriages are more common in collectivistic cultures. And the other thing is dependence on social worth and relationships is very important in collectivistic cultures, whereas in individualistic cultures, it's more about the self. And in terms of fundamental motivations, collectivist cultures focus more on avoiding loss of respect, because respect by others can be easily lost and is difficult to regain. People in individualistic cultures focus more on achievement of pleasure or reward, and that leads to self-enhancement in those cultures. Now, there are ways that we've tried to make this, sort of two-sided model more complex. One is to look at a second dimension of a vertical versus horizontal. So vertical is where you assume individuals are importantly different in some way, and horizontal is where you view individuals as essentially equal. So you can have collectivist cultures, like say China, that tends to be more horizontal, at least philosophically. But you can also have collectivist cultures like India that are vertical, and there's a rigid caste system, right? Other dimensions, self-compassion. Self-compassion is holding painful emotions in mindful awareness while essentially taking care of yourself. So having feelings of kindness and care extended to yourself while being aware of your own painful emotions. And what we find is that there was a study that looked at this in Taiwan, Thailand, and the US. And the highest level of self-compassion was actually in Thailand, and they attributed this to the fact that Buddhism is a popular religion and philosophy in Thailand, which is sort of rooted in self-compassion. Interestingly, the lowest levels were in Taiwan, and they attributed this to the fact that sort of the prevailing thought there is Confucianism. Human beings are teachable, improvable, and perfectible through personal and communal endeavor, especially including self-cultivation and self-creation. A main idea is the cultivation of virtue and development of moral perfection. Confucianism also holds that one should give up one's life, if necessary, either passively or actively, for the sake of upholding the cardinal moral values. So very different, right, than the self-compassion in Buddhism. The US, as our individualistic culture, was between those two collectivistic cultures. And another thing to remember is, like anything else we'll talk about, it doesn't apply equally or even at all to every person within that particular culture. So I just think of like people who come from collectivistic cultures who live in the US, right, might be more collectivistic. Now, in terms of assessment, right, we need to make sure that when we assess things across cultures, that our assessments mean the same thing to people in all the countries. So is the meaning the same, or is it different for different cultures? So the big five are traits that we'll discuss a lot more later in the semester. And they are something that we find factor analytically. So what they do is they have people either fill out questionnaires, or like old school research actually went through dictionaries and found words that describe personality traits, and then they factor analyze them, and they come up with these over and over and over in different cultures. And I'm actually gonna throw these in the chat. I'd normally write them on the board, but so the big five is with the acronym OCEAN. So it's openness, experience, conscientiousness, I always spell wrong if I don't look at it, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So we find those over and over and over in different cultures and different studies. Many variations have also been found, both across and within cultures. Research shows that of the big five, only conscientiousness, extroversion, and agreeableness are really universal. And then when we get to the other ones, they kind of vary. There are also difficulties of translation. They're never exact, so we don't know if they are really measuring the same thing. And there are other factors other than the big five that we do tend to see come up. So unselfishness, gentle temper, dependency, fragility, positive valence, negative valence, pleasantness, engagement, interpersonal relatedness. And again, some of these may be more important to some cultures rather than others. So what about other types of differences? Well, sex or gender differences. Sidebar here, sex is biological. It's not as set in stone as people think. There aren't just XXXY. You can have XXY and all kinds of different permeations. Gender is a social construct. Gender is how we perform what is expected of our sex. So for a long time, this has been called sex differences that we look at. So the history of the study of sex differences, before 1973, there was very little research on this. And then in 1974, the book, The Psychology of Sex Differences, was published. So they said that women had better verbal ability than men. Men had better mathematical and spatial ability than women. Men had more aggression than women. And there wasn't enough research to determine other differences. Now, one thing I'll say is even back with this original study, the differences that did exist were very, very small. And this sparked a lot more research. So after the publication of this book, journals started to require authors to calculate and report sex differences, which meant women were included in a lot more studies. Before this, when they were deciding on universals about human behavior, they often only included men as participants in the study. So there's a great book about sort of the history of racism in psychology called Even the Rat Was White. And that book really could be called Even the Rat Was White and Male. Like, not until they studied female rats did they discover like some of the more nurturing behaviors that exist, for example. In 1992, the federal government started requiring that studies include both sexes if they received federal funding, unless there was a research question that was gender specific. But there are maybe some issues with these, right? So if we look at something like aggressiveness, which if we think about the big five is actually just the opposite end of agreeableness. So in physical aggression, yes, men do tend to score higher than women. Effect sizes range from sort of medium to large here. And remember, effect size is just a measure of like how strong is that relationship. Imagined aggression, which is how you imagine showing aggression against others, is also higher in men than women. And this does seem to have a large effect on daily life, whereas men are much more likely to perpetrate violent crime, particularly the vast majority of mass shooters are men. I think there's been like one woman in recent years. But what about other forms of aggression? Women may show aggression differently than men. In particular, there's a construct called relational aggression. So this is the best way to describe relational aggression is to think about the movie Mean Girls. Okay, the movie Mean Girls is 100% relational aggression. It's the backstabbing, it's the spreading rumors about someone else, right? And, you know, yeah, maybe this isn't going to leave someone physically bleeding in the street, but this can sabotage someone's career, or this is the type of aggression that can lead to suicides after cyberbullying, for example. So this is still very damaging. There's also evidence to suggest that violent crimes among women are increasing. And so these suggest that these sex differences in aggression are probably largely in part due to socialization of what's an acceptable way to express your aggression. Now, where do cultural differences come from? Why are cultures actually different? What determines the specific distinctive psychology that a particular culture develops? So a lot of psychologists and other disciplines will kind of try to avoid this issue, and they talk about what's called deconstructivism, which says that reality has no meaning apart from what humans invent or construct. So for that reason, it says these questions about cultural differences are unanswerable. Obviously, this is not a useful approach here. So one of the approaches that actually does try to explain this is the ecological approach. So this views that differences exist because different cultures developed in different circumstances with the need to deal with different problems. So ecology is the physical layout and resources of the land, and distinctive tasks and challenges are going to arise from that. So where you live physically, right, is going to impact your culture. It's going to impact how you socialize with other people. That will impact personality definition and expression, partially through your behavior. So some examples. The need for complex agricultural projects and water systems in China required coordination and resulted in collectivism. The need for hunting in Germany, which required more individual effort and resulted in individualism. And again, these are only speculations, but you know, certainly a possibility. And socialization here, I should give a side note, is what we are explicitly and implicitly taught during childhood. So it's things like don't do that versus, you know, what you see other people, particularly adults, doing. Cultural differences from personality differences. Genetics may affect both personality and culture, but genetic differences are small at most, as we've sort of hinted at, and traits are likely to be weak predictors of behavior at the cultural level. And they're even weaker at the individual level, which we'll talk about later in the semester. People within cultures differ from each other, as we've already mentioned, right? Not everyone, even in this class, is the same, right? We all have different opinions. We all have different personalities, ways we act. And the data that support this idea can be explained in other ways. So one of the big things is what's called ethnocentrism. which is judging another culture from the point of view of one's own. So this is what I hinted at the beginning of our lecture today. The idea that we say our culture is great and everything else is inferior. That's ethnocentrism. So observations of other cultures will be influenced by your own cultural background. And you might always think of other cultures as weird or different, right? I can't believe they do that. But if one of them came to our culture, they'd probably say the same thing, right? And then the exaggeration of cultural differences is often based on assuming all individuals of a culture are alike, which we've already said isn't the case, right? The focus on research has been differences, both for research on gender and on cultures. And large sample sizes in these studies tend to lead to finding significant results, even when those differences are really small, because the way statistics work, if you have a larger sample, you're much more likely to find significant results, even with small differences. There's also what's called outgroup homogeneity bias. This is an extension of the fundamental attribution error, essentially. It's a bias to see members of groups to which we don't belong as being similar. Those people do this, right? In fact, cultures are more similar than different, maybe not surprisingly. In fact, there's a lot of great research recently. One of the people I love who does this research for gender in particular is Janet Hyde, where they've looked at these things on larger scales and find that most of the gender difference, most of the cultural differences, most of the racial differences just wash out and we're much more similar than different. I love Janet Hyde. One of my favorite quotes by her is, "I fight not with data, not with my fists, but with data." Now, in terms of where do we go from here? How do we start to do this in a more appropriate way? We need to look more at like subcultures and multiculturalism. It's difficult to define culture. And we know that important subgroups exist within large cultures. People can belong to more than one culture. And there's what's called bicultural identity integration, where you see the world and yourself through more than one cultural lens. And some bicultural people experience stress from trying to integrate the two, maybe not surprisingly. And the continuum among which people with two cultural backgrounds differ in the extent to which they see themselves as members of joint cultures that integrates aspects of both cultures versus having that conflict and stress is really a continuum. It's not just your one or other, or everybody experiences the stress. For some people, it's no big deal. For some people, it's like crippling. And for most people, it's somewhere in the middle. So the new universal human condition is the new emphasis on how people are psychologically similar. So strength of emotional feelings. Even though the way we express feelings might differ slightly in cultures, we know that regardless of culture, humans feel emotions to the same strength, the same depth. The desire to please your parents seems to be universal, but differences in what the parents' expectations are and the intensity of the experiences will differ based on culture and subculture. And then your personal goals. Even if you're in a collectivist culture, everybody always has personal goals. All right, so again, this is like scratching the nail on the surface. Dr. Marderall is now teaching a cross-cultural psychology class. So I highly recommend if you're interested in this to take it. I also teach psych of gender, which gets at a lot of these same issues. So I recommend that as well. Yeah, so, you know, how do we integrate cultures in a way that makes sense? You know, is our culture class just over something like measurement? Alrighty, so that is it. As usual, I'll stick around for a couple minutes if anyone has any questions. If not, I will see you on Monday and come prepared to discuss all the readings about culture.
Bye.
Have a great weekend. Thank
You too.
Bye.
Oh, Dr. Myers, I forgot to ask you. I wanted to just have you repeat what the bicultural identity integration is. Like, how do they see the world?
So it's like both ways. Two ways of looking at it.
Okay.
Some people trying to integrate those is really stressful.
Got it. Okay, great. Thank
That's
you.
actually what I was gonna say to you too. I'm Native American. I'm Comanche Nation and Kiowa tribe. So like we're a collectivist culture, and also matriarchal. So things are a little bit different. So a lot of times I feel like like a foreign exchange student.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of joke about this even. So I am from the Midwest, and I did my internship in Augusta, Georgia, which is the deep South. And
Oh yeah, I was stationed there. So
I call it my like study abroad year. It was just so different. So I can only imagine how you feel because it's even more.
yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Amanda. That's really interesting.
I really appreciated like your references to Native Americans too. Like I don't see a lot of representation of my culture in college unless like I go to a Native American school. So like a lot of times whenever there's charts that discuss things by race, mine won't even be on there.
Oh, geez. Yeah, a lot of what we look at is like only Black versus white, which like we need to do that research, don't get me wrong, but yeah, you're right, spot on that we need to do much more for Indigenous peoples as well.
Thank you. Have a good
Thank
weekend.
you for sharing. Yeah, have a good weekend.
Okay, I just wanted to check in with you real quick. I know I sent you an email the other day, but like I'm more of like a talk to a person, and I always feel like even if I send an email, like it doesn't feel the same